Okay, now let's think about this value creation hierarchy. We already talked about the goal of a firm, in other words, why a firm exists, and we said that profitability is the goal of a firm. In other words, firm exists to earn profit. But in order to earn profit, the company must create certain values, right? So that's the value. And basically, the value must be defined by the customer. Of course, sometimes some people think, or some managers think, value can be defined by internal managers or in-house engineers or scientists. But actually, that was the case probably in the 1960s or 70s. During those times, managers thought that they themselves could define the value, and then based on that value, they made their products and provided services to the market, and they assumed that the market or the customers would like them. But that was then. In other words, during 1970s or early 80s, supply was usually less than demand. In other words, the firm dominating period. The customers are just buying those products and services offered by the companies. But nowadays, the situation is changed quite significantly. We might say that the bargaining power shifted to the market, shifted to the customers or consumers. And therefore, the firm must not believe that it can actually define the value unilaterally. So the value nowadays believe that it must be defined by the customers and by the market, and therefore the firm must try to understand what the market truly wants, what the customers really want to buy. Okay, so value creation is the precondition for profitability. And then there are two ways for a firm to create value. In other words, either make physical products or provide services. Sometimes there is a really clear distinction between products and services, but nowadays I believe that it is not very meaningful to make any distinction between products and services. For example, is McDonald's a service company or manufacturing company? When we look at the hamburgers as a physical product, it seems like McDonald's is a manufacturing company. But in the McDonald's transaction process, the customers are really involved, very much involved in the value creation process. Then we would just say that McDonald's is a service-intensive company. So is McDonald's a service company or manufacturing company? Both, actually. And that happens all the time. Think about Hyundai Motor. It's an automobile company, car maker. Is it a manufacturing company? Obviously, because the company produces cars, which is a physical product. But nowadays, when the consumers buy cars, they are not just looking for physical things only. They want to get great services from the company as well. It's not just services at the point of purchase only. Sometimes we want to have very, efficient and effective maintenance policies, which is a big portion of the services. And therefore, nowadays, car makers like Hyundai Motor and BMW, they are all mixture of manufacturing and services. So we cannot say that physical product is completely different or distinguished from services or vice versa. So every company has to focus on physical products and also services at the same time. And now let's go down this hierarchy a little bit further. And then what should the company do, or what should the company have in order to make products or in order to provide services? I would just say there are three things. First of all, the firm must have resources to make product or to provide the services. Think about this car maker, Hyundai Motor or BMW. In order for the company to build a car, it must have raw materials and resources, right? It probably needs to have a steel, plastics, some chemicals, or some electronic devices, and all those things. And also, they need human resources as well. So resources are one of those conditions, one of those factors the firm must have in order to create value, in order to make products or services. But let's say the company has lots of resources in its warehouse. Is it enough? I mean that if you have lots of resources, are those resources transforming themselves into final products or services? That is not the case. And again, let's think about this car making industry or automobile industry. Those resources must go through certain tasks and activities, and they are called processes. And think about this assembly line. The raw materials and steels and plastics and some chemical materials, they must go through a series of activities through which those resources are transformed into the final product. So, in order to make a product or in order to provide the services, the firm must utilize these resources. In other words, the firm must have some processes. Processes are actually the activities and functions. So by performing those activities, tasks, and functions, the firm can transform those resources into the final product. Okay, so we know that the resources and processes are the two most important factors the firm must have in order to create value. But now let's say there are two companies, company A and company B. And let's say in terms of resources, the company has same or very similar type of resources. Probably the two companies have, the same raw material suppliers. And let's say these two companies have the same processes. Probably they bought the same machines from the same vendors and same equipment and so on and so forth. Of course, we cannot assume that the resources and processes are exactly the same, but for the sake of explanation, let's assume that company A and B have resources and processes that are sufficiently similar. Having said that, let's say they make their product. In other words, let's say the company A makes a certain product, we call that product A, and company B makes product, we call that product B. But these two products are the same. Let's say this is a car. if the two companies use the same resources and utilize the same processes, can you say the output of these two companies are exactly the same? Do you think that if BMW and some other companies, maybe in China, in Korea, or whatever, let's say, there is another company, car maker, and suppose the BMW and the other car maker uses the same resources and same processes, can we say that the cars produced by these two companies are exactly the same? Probably not. We do not want to say that these two products are exactly the same simply because they use the same resources and same processes. Why is that? Somehow, that implies that we believe there is another thing, another factor that is required in order to make products and services, in order to create value. And that factor is quite different between different companies. And we would just say that that's the capability. In other words, company A has its own capability and company B has its own capability. And depending on what kind of capability each company has, their products will be different, even if they use the same resources and same processes. Okay, so I would call these three things, resources, processes, and capabilities, as the fundamental building blocks for value creation. In other words, in order to make products and services, every company, every firm must have these three factors: resources, processes, and capabilities. And now the issue is very clear. Traditionally, operations management is about how to utilize, how to manage all these three things: resources, processes, and capabilities, in order to make products and services that are valued by the customers, that are valued by the market, so that we can maximize this profit. That's more traditional perspective of operations management. Now, that sounds interesting, right? Operations management is about value creation by utilizing these three fundamental building blocks effectively. But in the past, probably again in 1980s, in 1990s, traditional operations management was more focused on individual companies' value creation. In other words, the main focus was within one single individual company's boundary. But let's think about what's happening these days. Let's think about Apple. I want to understand what is the competitive advantage of Apple. I want to understand how Apple creating value, how and why Apple is such a good company. I want to understand that. But if I look at resources and processes and capabilities owned by Apple only, can I explain the competitive advantage of Apple? Probably not. Even if I understand to a certain extent, that cannot be complete. I cannot truly understand Apple's competitive advantage by looking at Apple's own resources, processes, and capabilities. Why? Because Apple does not make its own physical products in general, right? Apple does not have huge in-house manufacturing. And in order to understand Apple's competitive advantage, we have to understand how these physical products, iPhones, iPads, iPod, these physical products, how these things are made. Even if Apple is very good at designing, how can Apple create value? How can Apple earn money? Apple finally earns money by selling physical things, physical iPhones, physical iPads, and physical iPods. But very interestingly, Apple does not make those things. Then who makes those things for Apple? One of those companies, one of those partners working with Apple is Foxconn in China. So if we truly understand Apple's competitive advantage, we have to look at not only Apple's own resources, processes, and capabilities, but also we have to look at Foxconn's resources, processes, and capabilities. In other words, nowadays, if we truly understand the company's competitive advantage, company's competence, we have to look beyond that company's own boundary. In other words, we have to go beyond a single company's boundary, and we have to look at the companies that share the same value chain, that share the same supply chain with the company. So now our perspective must shift from a single company's boundary to multiple companies, multiple partners that share the same value chain, that share the same supply chain. And if we have that kind of perspective, that's exactly the value chain perspective. And now we have to understand this inter-firm coordination. And that's basically about supply chain management. Supply chain management is about looking at all those firms and all those activities that consist in the value chain, consist in the supply chain. I want to talk about more details about value chain and the supply chain, so on and so forth. Obviously, we already talked about value chain, supply chain a lot so far, but even without defining those things more formally. But I think that all of you probably have at least some casual understanding of these terminologies. So I thought that it was okay for us to talk about this concept even before we formally define these things more clearly. Before I start more formal definition of value chain, supply chain, I want to give a caveat. I talked about this resources, processes, and capabilities as the three fundamental building blocks, but sometimes they are overlapping with each other. In other words, some people say that processes are part of resources. That'll be fine. Or some people say that human resources are the sources of capabilities, and therefore there is some overlap between resource and capability, resource process, and also process and capability. That's fine. I'm not saying that the resources and process and capabilities are three completely distinguishable elements. I think they are related with each other, and they are sometimes have some overlaps with each other. That'll be fine. That's very natural, and I totally accept that. But the reason I want to look at these three elements separately is that although they overlap with each other, to a large extent, they are really independent concepts. And I think that by understanding these elements independently, we will be better able to understand this entire picture of supply chain management.